Welcome to Season 3, Episode 6 of CSS Breakdown, Book by Book. In this chapter of Michael Kimmel's The Gendered Society, we examine one of the most mythologized institutions in American life, the family, and how its structure, meanings, and gender roles have evolved under the weight of social and economic change.
That's right. Today we're diving into excerpts from Kimmel's book, specifically the section that really grapples with the American family, what it is, what people think it is, and why there's just so much debate swirling around it.
And our mission here, as always on the deep dive, is to try and cut through some of that myth, the nostalgia. We want to look at the history, the data, and the arguments laid out in this source material to, understand the complex reality of families today.
It's funny, isn't it? The source points out that Americans have been, well, incredibly confused and worried about the family for a really long time. We've apparently been debating whether it's in crisis since at least the late 19th century.
Wow, over a century of hand-wringing. What were the big worries back then?
Well, back then, concerns included men focusing maybe too much on their jobs, becoming less involved at home. The source uses the phrase absentee landlords, kind of paints a picture. And there was genuine anxiety that if women entered the workforce or, say, gained political rights like voting, the whole family structure would just crumble.
That sounds eerily familiar to some debates we still hear today.
Absolutely. And the source dives right into this whole debate,
Hmm.
presenting the arguments and the data that people use to claim the family is in crisis right now.
Okay, so let's unpack that. If someone argues the family is falling apart today, what kind of evidence from the source might they point to?
Well, the source says that if you just look at certain numbers, the picture can seem, well, overwhelmingly in favor of a crisis narrative.
Okay.
For instance, surveys suggest married people are reporting less happiness than they did, say, a generation ago. Yeah, and there's data pointing to increased isolation, people having fewer close friends, fewer confidants, and maybe a sense that genuine community support for families has kind of dwindled, often replaced by, abstract talk of family values that, as the source dryly notes, you can't eat.
Right, that feeling of maybe being alone in your struggles, even when you're technically surrounded by family.
Exactly. And then there are the big shifts in marriage patterns themselves. The source highlights that marriage rates have declined quite significantly. It points out that the rate in 2007 was the lowest seen in over 40 years.
That's a big drop.
It is. And think about this. In 2007, only about 2/3 of American women aged 35 to 44 were legally married. That's a major demographic shift from what people might picture.
Yeah, that feels like a profound change compared to, say, the mid-20th century image.
It really does. And, hand in hand with declining marriage rates, you see this dramatic rise in cohabitation.
People living together without being married.
Right. The source gives figures showing millions more couples living together outside of marriage compared to just a few decades ago. Millions.
So people are still forming partnerships, maybe just not always formalizing them in the same way.
Precisely. And then, of course, the source brings up divorce rates, which remain quite high. It notes that nearly 40% of first marriages end in divorce.
40%, wow.
Yeah, and a significant majority of those, about 60%, involve children.
Which is often where the concern about children comes in, really fueling that crisis talk, isn't it?
Exactly. The source also points to the increase in births to unmarried people that's now about 1/3 of all births in the U.S. And this trend is seen across racial groups, though the percentages vary. There have been notable increases for both white and black women over recent decades, according to the data presented.
And then there's that statistic about children growing up without their biological fathers present in the home.
Yes. The source highlights that over 1/3 of children live without their biological fathers, and it presents data suggesting children raised by only one parent are more likely to face certain challenges. Things like higher rates of poverty, increased risk of crime or dropping out of school, maybe lower grades, emotional problems.
Okay.
Now, it's really vital to remember, and the source implies this by presenting it alongside other factors, that this often shows a correlation. Exploring why that correlation exists is complex. It involves looking at factors like poverty, which the source gets into later.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily saying single parenthood and isolation causes these issues.
Right, correlation isn't causation. That's a crucial distinction. Okay, so that's the picture painted by the family crisis proponents, using numbers like declining marriage, rising cohabitation and divorce, changing birth patterns. But the source doesn't just leave it there, right? It offers a strong counterargument.
Oh, it pushes back significantly. The source argues that despite feeling fragile, the family might actually be among the most resilient institutions we have. It challenges the whole idea that the family was ever static or unchanging, calling that a mythic construction.
So the argument is it's always been changing.
Yes, American families, the source emphasizes, have always changed and adapted throughout history.
So the counter-argument is that change is just, well, change. It's not necessarily decay or collapse.
Exactly. The source concludes there's actually only modest evidence that the family is truly in decline or decay. And it offers counter statistics. Despite the lower rates of marriage at any given moment, the vast majority of Americans, over 9 in 10, still get married at some point in their lives.
That's a key distinction, the lifelong likelihood versus the snapshot rate.
Right. And the source points out that the proportion of women who remain single their entire lives is actually lower now than it was back at the turn of the 20th century.
Interesting historical perspective.
Isn't it? Plus, high remarriage rates. Almost half of all marriages are second or later marriages. Suggest people still believe in the institution of marriage, even if their first experience was difficult.
It's like saying, okay, that specific marriage didn't work out, but I'm willing to try marriage again.
Precisely. The source also highlights the increase in men who strongly identify as fathers, and the growing number of single fathers raising children on their own.
So fatherhood is perhaps changing too.
And here's where the source adds a really pointed observation. Virtually everyone wants to get married, including gay men and lesbians, and their very campaigns for marriage equality are, somewhat ironically, often opposed by the same groups who claim to be defending the sanctity of marriage.
That's a powerful paradox the source uses to kind of challenge that simple crisis narrative. So if the family isn't objectively crumbling according to these counterpoints in the source, why is there so much talk and worry, this constant sense of crisis?
This is where the source offers a really insightful explanation, moving beyond just the raw numbers to look at how we perceive and talk about family. It argues this noise, this ongoing debate, stems from three key things. Something called misplaced nostalgia, what it terms a displaced quarrel with feminism, and a fundamental misreading of history.
Okay, let's break those down. Start with misplaced nostalgia. What does the source mean by that?
It's basically about holding up the 1950s family, the image of the breadwinner dad, stay-at-home mom, 2.5 perfect kids in the suburbs as this timeless ideal standard, the gold standard against which all other families are measured.
The Leave It to Beaver ideal.
Exactly. The source brings in anthropologist Raymond Birdwhistle, who studied families in rural Kentucky. He found that the idealized, romanticized version of their past families, what he called the sentimental model, was actually very different from the messy, complex reality they had lived through.
So we're essentially judging modern, diverse families against a sort of fictionalized, maybe rose-tinted version of the past.
That's the argument. And the source notes that this blurred and ahistorical vision isn't just personal nostalgia. It can actually get baked into public policy, ignoring the realities of modern life, like the fact that most women work outside the home now, or the sheer diversity of family structures we see.
That makes a lot of sense. It's much easier to declare the family is failing if your comparison point is an unreachable, perhaps never really existent ideal.
Which leads right into the second point.
Yeah.
The displaced quarrel with feminism. The source argues that a lot of the hand-wringing over family values is actually just opposition to feminism, sort of wearing a disguise.
Ah, the familiar pattern of blaming feminism for social changes that makes some people uncomfortable.
Precisely. Feminism is often wrongly blamed, or sometimes even credited, for what the source identifies as arguably the single greatest transformation of American society in the 20th century, which is the massive entry of women into the paid workforce.
Right.
The source is careful to point out that women working outside the home was already happening long before the modern feminist movement really gained steam in the 60s and 70s. But the feminist movement did give a name to the dissatisfaction many women felt, challenging concepts like the feminine mystique and providing a political voice for women wanting lives beyond just the domestic sphere.
So the economic and social change was already underway, but feminism provided the framework for understanding it and discussing it politically, which then made it a clearer target for those resisting that change.
That's the source's argument, yes. And the third point underpinning the noise is a misreading of history. We tend to think of the family as this totally private sphere, right? A warm, personal haven, separate from the cold, impersonal world of work and government.
The classic haven in a heartless world idea. Very appealing.
Very. But the source strongly challenges this. It argues the family has never been a world apart. The modern family, even those idealized versions, was built upon and is continually supported by a huge infrastructure of economic and political systems. Well, think about how public funds built the roads that led to the suburbs, funded the schools kids attended, how government policies like the GI Bill made home ownership possible for many, and the whole legal framework that defines what marriage is, how divorce works.
Right. So the idea that government or the economy should just stay out of family life is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how families have actually always functioned and been supported.
Absolutely. The source points to the historical concept of the family wage, the idea that a man's income should be enough to support a whole family, as a clear example of how economic and family life have always been deeply intertwined and structured around specific family ideals. This underlying public support is often invisible in current debates, leading to this ongoing misreading of history. The source explicitly notes that the crisis debate itself is a century old, suggesting it's a recurring pattern rooted in these historical misunderstandings.
That's a really powerful reframing from the source, suggesting the debate isn't just about statistics, but about our selective memory, maybe our discomfort with social progress, and our failure to see the deep historical connections between families and the broader society.
And that reframing is really key to understanding the historical journey the source takes us on next, detailing how the American family structure and the gender roles within it have actually evolved dramatically over time.
Okay, let's step back in time then. According to the source, how did family life look in earlier America, say, before the 19th century?
Well, back in the 18th and early 19th centuries, the source describes what's been called the Little Commonwealth family. Interestingly, compared to women in Europe at the time, American women actually had relatively more freedom, things like no dowries, the ability to own property after marriage. The family unit itself was seen less like a rigid hierarchy and more as a common enterprise.
The more collaborative unit, maybe.
Kind of, yeah. There was less of that strict division between his and her work spheres that came later. Both women and men typically worked in or very near the home. Women were often producing essential goods. The family needed food, clothing. Men's work, often agricultural, was more tied to the family's needs and rhythms, not an industrial clock.
And what about parenting roles back then? Were they different too?
Significantly different. Fathers and mothers were both actively involved in child-rearing. The source cites historian John DeMoss's description of active, encompassing fatherhood. And here's something surprising. Child-rearing manuals at the dawn of the 19th century were often written to fathers, not mothers.
Really? To fathers?
Yes. Children were typically raised in a less formal, somewhat sex-segregated pattern, often spending more time learning from their same-sex parent.
So fathers were expected to be hands-on, teach their sons, and mothers their daughters. That's a stark contrast to the later image of the distant breadwinning father.
It is. But the source then details a dramatic transformation that happened in the first few decades of the 19th century. This is when that physical and ideological gap between the world of work and the world of home really widened. Family life, as the source puts it, got wrenched apart from the world of work, creating that clear separation of spheres. His public world, her private world.
That defining characteristic of the Victorian-era family structure.
Exactly. And the source uses Alfred Lord Tennyson's 1849 poem, The Princess, as a perfect, almost stark encapsulation of this ideology. Man for the field and woman for the hearth, man for the sword and for the needle she, man with the head and woman with the heart, man to command and woman to obey, all else confusion.
Wow, a very clear and obviously very unequal division of labor and being.
Unequal is absolutely the key word. The source explains how, under this new ideology, women's work in the home, cleaning, cooking, raising children, all still essential, was no longer seen as actual work. It was reconceptualized as a kind of God-given mission, a calling. Housekeeping and child-rearing became rigidly defined as exclusively women's work.
And the source points out that this seemingly complementary system was anything but equal in practice.
Absolutely not. The source quotes Catherine Beecher and Harriet Beecher Stowe's 1869 book, which explicitly states the man is the head and chief magistrate, and the wife is to obey. Historians like Gerda Lerner, cited in the source, argue this ideology actually represented a historical decline in women's status. It excluded them from the new opportunities of democracy and capitalism, effectively imprisoning them in the domestic sphere. The source notes this required significant ideological buttressing from poetry, sermons, and culture to maintain.
And while women were confined to the home, men were also sort of pushed out of it in a way?
Right. The source notes that even back in the early 1800s, critics were already complaining about men spending too little time at home. A Reverend John S.C. Abbott in 1842 lamented paternal neglect. This separation created that idea of the family as a haven in a heartless world, specializing in emotional support and child-rearing, having lost its earlier productive economic functions.
And the source is careful to note that this ideal of separate spheres, the specific family model, was largely limited to white middle-class families, wasn't it?
Yes, that's a crucially important point the source makes. It was promoted as the universal American norm, but for working-class families, immigrant families, and families of color, economic necessity often meant women had to continue working outside the home. And men in those families often shared more in domestic tasks simply because they had to. Minority women, in particular, the source notes, often functioned primarily as workers in both public and private realms just to keep their families afloat.
So the dominant ideal was far from the universal reality. The source also mentions the invention of some things we might think of as timeless family traditions during this period.
Yes, this is fascinating. Things like regular private family meal times. Before industrialization, meals were often more informal, maybe less private. Holidays used to revolve more around community festivals, not just private family gatherings. The source points out that rituals like leisurely dinner hours, dedicated Sunday family time, and celebrating holidays like Christmas primarily as a nuclear family unit were essentially invented or solidified in the mid-19th century.
That really highlights how actively the concept and practices of family were being reshaped during that time.
Indeed. And rapid industrialization after the Civil War only cemented these trends. By the end of the 19th century, the source states, very few married women worked outside the home, and likely very few men worked primarily inside it. Motherhood became the dominant, almost sole identity for middle-class women, and the perceived importance of fatherhood diminished significantly.
Which led to those observations the source quotes from the early 20th century, like the father being a Sunday institution.
Exactly. And comments like, it's time father got back in the family. There were even early efforts to address this perceived problem, like Theodore Roosevelt's 1909 White House Conference on Children. Roosevelt, while driven partly by some problematic concerns about declining birth rates among white native-born Americans, did recognize that poverty, especially for single mothers, was a core issue. He even advocated for government financial support for capable widowed mothers.
So even back then, there was a glimmer of recognizing that structural issues like poverty deeply impact families, and maybe government had a role. This really sets the stage for what many people do think of as the traditional family, the 1950s.
Ah, yes. The period ripe with that misplaced nostalgia we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
The source describes the period from roughly 1945 to 1960 as dramatically different from what came before and after. And it argues this difference was specifically shaped by a massive infusion of public expenditures designed to support that particular nuclear family ideal. The breadwinner husband, the housewife mother, the kids in the suburbs.
So public money was actively used to construct and promote this specific family form.
That's the source's argument. Think about housing policies that favored single-family homes in the suburbs, the GI Bill helping veterans buy those homes and get jobs, the highway system connecting suburbs to workplaces, all facilitated this model. This era saw a temporary spike in marriage rates and a lower age for first marriage compared to earlier or later periods. The source explicitly cites family historians who see this as an unusual series of historical, demographic, and economic circumstances unlikely to return again, a kind of historical anomaly.
So the source is saying the 50s family wasn't some natural return to an old tradition, but a specific government-backed temporary creation.
Pretty much. And it was immediately declared natural and aggressively promoted through culture and policy. The source quotes historian William Chafe on the almost frantic effort to reinforce these norms, perhaps because, the source implies, something different, some unease, was already brewing beneath the surface.
And sociology at the time provided academic backing for this model.
Yes, the dominant sociological theory then was structural functionalism, with figures like Talcott Parsons arguing that this isolated nuclear family with clearly separated gender roles, the expressive female, the instrumental male, was necessary for socializing children properly and for the stability of society.
The source's quote from the 1955 sociologist really captures the rigidity of those expected roles.
It paints that picture vividly. The father occasionally helping with domestic tasks like dishes or formula, but defined almost entirely by his role as provider. His status came from his job and income. His main responsibility was financial support. Women, ideally worked before marriage, quit after, or took lower status jobs if they had to work.
And the mother was the emotional center.
Almost exclusively.
Yeah.
The source talks about the cult of the warm, giving mom, contrasted with the capable, competent, go-getting male.
Yeah.
Expressive traits in men were seen as effeminate,
That makes the expected roles incredibly clear and narrow.
and people tried to live up to them, the man in the gray flannel suit, women toiling under ever-increasing standards of household cleanliness.
Yeah.
Now, the source acknowledges that for many middle-class families, this period did offer real benefits: safer suburbs, a life centered around children's activities, companionable marriages where divorce was seen as a last resort.
Right.
The source even uses Archibald MacLeish's poem praising his wife's domestic role, the well-swept room, to show the powerful nostalgic appeal of this image, while also subtly noting the potential inequality in the line, "She has given me my own life to live in."
But that idealized image wasn't the full picture, was it? The source points to significant underlying discontent brewing beneath that veneer.
Right. That veneer of domestic bliss, as the source puts it, concealed a lot of restlessness and unhappiness for husbands, wives, and children. Fathers often felt alienated, perhaps better fathers in theory than in practice. Housewifery in this isolated suburban form was actually historically unprecedented, and many wives resented the senseless tyranny of spotless shirts, feeling trapped.
So the seeds of change were already there.
Yes. The source mentions Max Lerner's 1957 observation of the ordeal of the modern woman and the unhappy wife as a recognizable cultural type even then.
And this underlying dissatisfaction then fueled the social movements of the 1960s.
Exactly. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique in 1963 resonated so deeply because it spoke to this unspoken unhappiness, famously calling the suburban home a comfortable concentration camp, and arguing real life was outside worrying about housework. The source notes that alternative cultural archetypes were emerging. The beatnik, the playboy, the juvenile delinquent, and popular culture, like music, started highlighting the ironies and dissatisfactions of the suburban ideal, like in Mother's Little Helper.
So the source argues this traditional 1950s family didn't collapse because of some outside attack, but rather cracked under its own internal pressures and contradictions.
That's the core argument. It was burdened with too much expectation. It was supposed to be the sole source of comfort, intimacy, and pleasure in an increasingly bureaucratic world, replacing older community and kinship ties. This, the source suggests, was almost too much to bear, and made the model an anachronism from the moment of its birth.
And even in the 1960s, the reality on the ground was already more diverse than that single-earner ideal.
Significantly more diverse. The source states that fewer than half, only 43% of American families, actually fit this single-earner model even then. Almost a quarter, 23%, were already dual-earner couples. Though, importantly, it notes that a high percentage of children, both white and black, were still living with both parents at that time compared to later decades.
But then the source makes a somewhat surprising argument about the decades that followed the 60s.
It argues that the family in the 1970s and early 1980s actually became stronger and more resilient, precisely because of increasing diversity and flexibility. The source cites follow-up studies, like the return to Middletown, finding the family in better shape than it had been in the 1920s.
Why stronger?
The source credits better economic and social conditions for many better pay, more leisure time, better housing. It also points to parents spending more time with children then, and crucially, more flexible gender roles, increased opportunities for women, and better knowledge and access to birth control, which the source says markedly enhanced marital relationships.
So moving away from that rigid 50s model wasn't necessarily a sign of crisis, but potentially a sign of successful adaptation and even growth, according to this analysis from the source.
That's the counter-narrative presented for that period. However, the source then pivots, arguing that the family has been under significant strain since the early 1980s, but for different reasons. Primarily a dramatic withdrawal of public supports.
Connecting back to that idea that the family isn't purely private and depends on external factors.
Exactly. The source links this more recent strain to factors like decreased or stagnant wages, especially for men, decreased leisure time, cuts to public funding for things like housing, and the increased economic necessity for both parents to work just to make ends meet. It also includes the resurgence of restrictions on access to birth control and abortion as factors contributing to declines in the quality of family life.
Those sound like major external pressures hitting families hard.
They are significant pressures, and the source explicitly links these structural issues to family problems, citing the unfortunate increase in the percentage of children under 18 living in poverty, jumping from about 15% in 1970 to closer to 25% more recently. Even for middle-class families, the pressure comes from the erosion of leisure time and ever-increasing work demands.
The source's image of the 5 o'clock dad being an endangered species is really quite vivid, isn't it?
It highlights that reality. The source provides data showing a substantial percentage of men with young children are working extremely long hours, over 60 hours a week for more than 10%, and another 25% working 50, 60 hours. That's significantly higher than the rates for women with young children, putting immense pressure on family time even when there isn't immediate economic hardship.
So families have had to adapt and change in response to these pressures, but the source notes they've often faced misplaced criticism instead of support.
Yes, they've made changes and modifications, but often been met with prophets and pundits promoting false solutions instead of policies addressing the real structural issues. The source then provides extensive data detailing the major demographic shifts that have resulted from these pressures and adaptations since the 1960s.
Okay, let's look at some of those key shifts in the family landscape.
Well, the age of first marriage has steadily risen since the 60s by about 5 years for both men and women. The source gives average ages around 26 for women and 27 for men currently. Couples are generally having fewer children, often delaying childbearing to pursue education and careers.
And the living arrangements for children have changed dramatically.
Hugely. Today, the source notes, only about half of American children live in that traditional nuclear family with both birth parents. About 1/5 live in step-families, and over a quarter live in single-parent homes.
That's a massive difference from the figures cited for the 1960s.
It is. The number of single parents grew dramatically from 1970 through the early 90s. And interestingly, fathers now head a significant percentage, about 14% of those single-parent households with children. The source points out that these U.S. percentages for single-parent families and other diverse family structures are the highest among industrialized nations. It references tables and figures showing this decline of the traditional model.
So it really emphasizes how much the American family landscape has diverged compared to many other developed countries.
Absolutely. The source also details the rise of adults who have never married by certain ages and the significant increase in cohabitation. A much higher percentage of both men and women today haven't married by age 30 compared to 1970.
And cohabitation isn't just for young college kids anymore.
No, the source notes it's increasingly common across different groups. In fact, it suggests most cohabitors haven't attended college and that cohabitation might be replacing early marriage for less educated, poor, and working-class populations. Importantly, about 40% of these cohabiting households include children.
So the overall picture of the American family today, based on the source, is one of immense diversity.
The source quotes a Newsweek article that puts it bluntly, "The American family does not exist. Instead, we are creating many American families of diverse styles and shapes." The source lists the variety. Fathers working while mothers stay home, both parents working, single parents, second marriages, childless couples, unmarried couples with or without kids, gay and lesbian parents.
And the source uses a very prominent political example to illustrate how this diversity often exists even behind the public rhetoric of family values.
Yes, the source points directly to former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich, describing his own life as a model of diversity, raised in a single-parent home, divorced his first wife after she had cancer, reportedly failed to pay alimony or child support, had an affair while publicly promoting family values, and has a lesbian sister raising a family. The source uses this anecdote to show the gap between political rhetoric and the complex, often diverse realities of family life, even for its most outspoken proponents.
It certainly makes the point about diversity very concrete and maybe a little uncomfortable for some. And as families have diversified structurally, attitudes about gender roles within the family have also shifted significantly, according to the source.
Yes, the source cites sociologist Scott Coltrane, noting that support for that strict separation of spheres and the idea of automatic male dominance in the family has weakened dramatically, although, a substantial minority still holds traditional views.
The source gives specific examples of how these attitudes have changed over time.
It contrasts earlier views from the 1970s, where some men felt entitled to jobs over women if they had a family to support, with today, where that view is far less common. More broadly, the source presents survey data tracking a significant decline in agreement with statements like, "It is much better if the man is the achiever outside the home and the woman takes care of the home."
Hmm.
Agreement with that dropped from two-thirds in 1977 to less than two-fifths 20 years later, and even lower among baby boomers.
And the idea that a wife's primary role is to help her husband's career rather than have her own.
That, too, saw a sharp decline in agreement over just a couple of decades, dropping from over half agreeing in 1977 down to around 25% more recently. So the source clearly shows that while traditional ideas haven't vanished, there's been a major attitudinal shift towards more flexibility and equality in family roles.
It's becoming increasingly clear from the source material that the family is fundamentally a gendered institution. It both reflects and reproduces gender differences and inequalities.
That's a core argument the source makes throughout. It states explicitly that families are gendered institutions. Why? Because they are where children first learn what it means to be a boy or a girl in our society, and where parents are constantly prompted, subtly or not so subtly, to perform expected gender roles. So specific aspects like marriage, parenting styles, the division of housework, and even the experience of divorce are all deeply shaped by and express these underlying gender differences and inequalities.
Okay, let's look specifically at how marriage itself is gendered, according to the source. It points out a really fascinating cultural contrast in how we often view marriage versus, say, sex.
It's quite striking when you think about it. Culturally, we often portray marriage as something women actively seek, maybe even plot to trap men into.
Hmm.
Weddings are frequently depicted as primarily the bride's big day, her achievement. She landed a man, her future is secure. For men, though, marriage is culturally framed much more negatively. It's a loss of freedom, the old ball and chain. Bachelor parties are framed as this mournful last night of freedom. This whole cultural narrative implies marriage benefits women more, and men kind of get caught.
But compare that to how culture often portrays sex. It's something women have or control, and men want desperately, maybe willing to promise anything to get it.
Exactly. And the source argues that just as that cultural view of sex might be misleading, so is the cultural view of who benefits most from marriage. It cites sociologist Jessie Bernard's influential work from the early 1970s. She identified his and her marriages, two distinct experiences within the same union, and concluded unequivocally that his is better than hers. The social science research presented in the source suggests marriage disproportionately benefits men.
Really, what specific evidence does the source provide for that claim?
The source lists several key points based on research. On psychological measures like happiness and depression, married men are significantly happier than unmarried men. Unmarried women, interestingly, are often slightly happier than married women. The biggest happiness gap is between married and single men.
Okay.
Also, more men than women end up marrying over their lifetimes. Husbands consistently report higher satisfaction with their marriages than wives do.
And in terms of physical health and longevity, does marriage benefit men more there too?
According to the source, yes. Married men tend to live longer and enjoy better physical health than unmarried men, and actually enjoy better health than women, whether those women are married or unmarried.
Wow.
Plus, men are less likely to initiate divorce, and they remarry much more quickly after a divorce than women do. Widowers also tend to die sooner than widows after losing a spouse.
It sounds like being married is incredibly good for men's overall health and well-being based on the data presented in the source.
The data marshaled certainly points strongly in that direction. The source also notes significant economic benefits. Married men tend to earn more than single men, and single men are less likely to be employed, often have lower incomes, and are statistically more prone to risky behaviors like crime or drug use. From this social science perspective, the source argues, marriage appears to be a very advantageous institution for men.
But the source also mentions a more recent trend, a decline in subjective marital happiness for both men and women. What's driving that, according to the analysis?
Yes, this is a more recent development noted. The source links this decline back to those structural pressures we discussed earlier, things like the declining economic prospects for young men since the Reagan era, the increased tension between work and family demands for everyone, changing attitudes about domestic roles and housework, and crucially, the lack of government and institutional structural support, like affordable health care, child care, and family-friendly policies. The source essentially poses the question, how much more strain can the family institution absorb without these supports?
And speaking of strain, the source highlights a somewhat surprising, maybe even counterintuitive finding from research. Having children tends to decrease marital happiness.
It's a consistent finding in the research cited, apparently. Couples without children generally report higher levels of marital satisfaction. The source describes these childless couples as often being highly educated, living in urban areas with wives committed to careers, and generally having more financial resources. Perhaps this allows them to focus more energy on their relationship without the added demands and stresses of parenting.
And the source describes a specific trajectory, a pattern for marital happiness once children do arrive on the scene.
It cites sociologist Mary Bevan's research showing that marital happiness typically sinks with the arrival of the first baby, plunges again when the first child reaches school age, and drops even further during the teenage years. There's even a figure illustrating this dip.
Ouch, that doesn't sound great for parents.
No. And interestingly, the research cited found that husbands' marital satisfaction tends to rebound somewhat once children turn 18. But wives' satisfaction doesn't typically bounce back until the children actually leave home entirely.
That timing difference really suggests the burden or experience of parenting falls more heavily, or at least differently, on mothers, doesn't it?
Which connects directly back to the source's point about the family's role in actively reproducing gender. If one purpose of the family, consciously or not, is to maintain gender inequality between the parents, the other key purpose, the source argues, is to ensure that those gendered identities are imparted to the next generation. The family, in this view, is where the seeds of gender difference are planted, where we first learn that being a boy or a girl has profoundly different and unequal meanings in our society.
So the family isn't just a neutral backdrop where gender happens to exist. It's a primary site where gender is actively constructed, taught, and reinforced from day one.
That's precisely the argument. Gender socialization begins literally at birth, maybe even before, and continues throughout life. Parents, the source explains, come equipped with gender-specific ideas and expectations based on their own upbringing, cultural messages, things they read, advice from friends, those common adages like sugar and spice versus frogs and snails. They have hopes and desires for their children's future roles and personalities.
And this influence starts incredibly early, shaping how babies are treated.
Yes. The source gives specific examples of this gender typing. It can begin pre-birth with speculation about the baby's sex based on how it kicks, or through amniocentesis revealing the sex. Then, during infancy, the first 6 months to 2 years, parents interact differently. Research cited shows mothers tend to look at and talk to girl infants more and respond to their crying faster in the first couple of years. Boys might get more physical touch, like holding and rocking initially, but that reverses by 6 months. By the time they're a year old, girls are often encouraged, subtly or overtly, to maintain closer proximity to their mothers, while boys are allowed or encouraged to move away sooner and more often.
And why that difference in treatment?
The source links it directly to parents' beliefs about autonomy and independence. Common stereotypes suggest boys should be independent, so parents encourage exploration and mastery, weaning sons from constant physical contact earlier. Conversely, parents are often more restrictive with daughters from an early age, setting more limits on their exploration.
And the source emphasizes this isn't always like deliberate conscious teaching, but often reflects parents just internalizing and acting out accepted societal roles.
Right. Sons might be treated as naturally sturdy and active, played with more roughly, rewarded for stereotypical boy behaviors. Girls might be seen as delicate and gentle, receiving approval for sweetness and cooperation. And it's not just parents. Other adults reinforce this constantly. They interact with infants based on assumed gender norms, not the child's individual characteristics.
The source cited some really striking experiments illustrating this.
Yes, like giving babies gender-specific toys, dolls versus hammers, based only on the gender they were told the baby was, or describing the same baby, whose sex was unknown to the observers, with gendered adjectives strong and big if they thought it was a boy, soft and pretty if they thought it was a girl.
And the Jack-in-the-Box experiment.
Right. Observers interpreted the exact same startled reaction from the same baby as anger if they thought the baby was a boy and fear if they thought it was a girl. It really shows how powerfully gender expectations shape our perceptions.
Those examples are incredibly powerful illustrations of how pervasive and often unconscious gender bias can be, right from the absolute beginning.
And this gender typing only intensifies in toddlerhood around age 2 and up. Boys are explicitly told things like, boys don't cling, big boys don't cry. Independence, aggression, and suppressing emotions are rewarded. Non-compliance brings disapproval. Girls, on the other hand, are often encouraged to express their emotions, control aggression, or given more opportunities for dependency, and their crying might be tolerated longer.
And then come the toys and play, which the source describes as heavily, intensely gendered.
The source calls the world of gendered toys ferocious. They are explicitly designed and sold as either girls' toys or boys' toys. Think pink aisles versus blue aisles in stores. Boys' toys remain heavily militarized, sports-themed, or involve action figures, which are explicitly not dolls.
Right. Action figures, not dolls.
Girls' toys, conversely, overwhelmingly anticipate traditional female roles, nurse kits, tea party sets, and of course dolls designed for nurturing play. The source gives the example of parents observing their 2.5-year-old boys preferring dolls or doll houses, but actively steering them away because those are perceived as girls' toys, showing how quickly children absorb these parental cues, which are then reinforced by advertising, salespeople, and peers.
The source also discusses the evolution from, say, Barbie to Bratz dolls as reflecting changing ideas about femininity.
Yes, that's an interesting side point. Barbie, in her original forms, often anticipated traditional roles like mother or caretaker. Bratz dolls, emerging later, represent a more modern, hypersexualized version of femininity, where girl power gets translated into sexualized clothing, makeup, and sometimes behaviors like drinking or clubbing. The source mentions Mattel even created a My Scene Barbie line to compete in this space, and notes the intense legal battle between Mattel and MGA, or the Bratz concept, highlighting how fiercely this market is driven by evolving but still powerful gender norms.
Physical appearance also becomes strongly tied to gender definitions from a very young age.
Yes. Girls are often rewarded for how they look, their attractiveness, cuteness, coyness. They learn early on to seek reflections of their value in others' eyes. Boys, conversely, are more often rewarded for athletic ability, physical performance, what their bodies can do. The source notes these differences continue right into adolescence.
And playmate choice becomes highly gender segregated as children get older and interact more with peers.
Research cited shows that after just 1 year in school, children strongly discriminate by sex when choosing playmates. Studies by Makobi and Jacqueline found young children prefer same-sex playmates, and that same-sex pairs played together more peacefully and steadily than mixed-sex pairs, even when the children were dressed identically in an experiment.
This early segregation leads to the development of what the source calls two gender cultures through their separate play worlds.
Exactly. As children increasingly play primarily with same-sex peers, boys learn prototypes for masculinity, including expectations about sexuality, things like rough and tumble play, competition, making direct demands, seeking dominance within the group. Girls, in their separate play world, learn prototypes for femininity using more subtle or indirect influence, focusing on maintaining relationships, ensuring everyone has a good time, also including learning expectations about female sexuality.
And the source highlights a really significant asymmetry in crossing over gender lines in play. It's not equal.
This is a crucial point. Boys tend to acquire their sense of masculinity largely by avoiding anything considered feminine. The label sissy is a very powerful negative sanction. Girls' identities, however, are modeled more on imitating women than on actively repudiating masculinity. The label tomboy is much less negative and more accepted.
So it's easier for girls to do boy things than for boys to do girl things.
Generally, yes. The source notes girls often have more boy toys than boys have girl toys. More boy activities are acceptable for girls than vice versa. This asymmetry, the source argues, shows that masculinity is constructed as a more rigid role, enforced partly through coercive socialization. The cultural definitions of what's right or appropriate reflect adult perspectives and, ultimately, who holds power in setting those rules. Children's play, the source concludes, isn't just practice for adult life, it is life itself, actively expressing and reproducing adult gender inequality.
And the source suggests that children understand this inequality, this hierarchy, at a surprisingly young age.
The source suggests they do absorb it. Girls sometimes express feeling they would be better off as boys or explicitly state a preference for being boys. Boys, conversely, tend to see being a girl as, quote, a fate worse than death. The source includes a really stark quote from a third-grade boy. If I were a girl, everybody would be better than me because boys are better than girls.
Wow, that quote really lands hard. It's so direct.
It is. And it shows, as the source explains, how deeply gender difference becomes tied to and used to justify gender inequality. Exaggerating the differences between boys and girls helps boys assure their higher status in that hierarchy. This constant reproduction of gender difference and inequality through routine family life, through children's interactions, is why, according to the source, understanding gender is so absolutely central to understanding the family as an institution.
This brings us directly to a major area where gender inequality plays out very clearly within families, the division of housework and childcare.
Absolutely. The source calls women's massive entry into the paid workplace the single greatest shock, the biggest transformation affecting the family in the past century. It's a profound social change that has rippled outwards, altering other institutions as well. And while some people might wish for a return to the 1950s model, the source notes it's pretty unlikely, as most people today, both men and women, work outside the home due to necessity, choice, or ambition.
And working outside the home generally has benefits for women. According to the source, things like higher self-esteem, less depression compared to full-time housewives.
Yes, but then we come back to that puzzle again regarding marital satisfaction. Working mothers consistently report lower marital satisfaction than their husbands do, and their husbands, in turn, are often happier than the husbands of traditional housewives.
And the source attributes this disparity directly to women's total workload increasing dramatically, paid work plus unpaid domestic work, while men often benefit from their wife's paid income plus roughly the same amount of domestic labor still being done for them by her.
Precisely. Women end up working more total hours, often feeling more stressed and enjoying family life less. This is where Arlie Hochschild, the hugely influential concept of the second shift, comes in, describing all the unpaid housework and childcare that women largely remain responsible for, even when they also work full-time outside the home.
The source calls this situation a stalled revolution.
Because women moved en masse into the workplace, but men haven't moved comparably into taking on domestic responsibilities at home. The revolution in gender roles, the source argues, has stalled because it depends on fundamental changes in men's attitudes and, more importantly, their behaviors regarding housework and childcare.
It wasn't always seen this way, was it?
No. The source cites Pat Minardi's classic 1970 essay, The Politics of Housework, which argued that the traditional family separation of spheres and the designation of housework as women's work wasn't about biological predisposition, but about male domination and convenience. Women did it because they had to, men avoided it because they could. The source even quotes Charlotte Perkins Gilman, writing way back in 1903 about the general distaste most people have for housework like cleaning.
So it was fundamentally a power dynamic, not some natural division of labor based on skill or preference.
That's the core argument presented. The source then discusses numerous studies looking at patterns of housework and childcare, and the overall conclusion is that men's participation in family work has been surprisingly resistant to change over the decades.
Really? Despite all the talk about change.
Well, studies cited show things like women's housework hours increasing significantly after marriage, while men's actually decrease because they stop doing things for themselves. Only a small fraction of men, maybe about 1/5 in some studies, fully share housework equally, though the source notes those couples tend to report being the happiest.
Though the source does point to one specific area where men's participation has changed dramatically and quickly, being present at the birth of their children.
Yes, that's a key example the source uses. From virtually no fathers being present 30 or 40 years ago to over 90% being present today. The source uses this to argue that men are capable of rapid change when there's sufficient motivation and societal expectation shifts.
But for the everyday, ongoing tasks, the gap persists significantly.
Yes, starkly so. The source notes women still do about 2/3 of the daily, routine tasks that really tie them to a rigid schedule. Things like cooking dinner every night, cleaning up afterwards. Men's contributions, while sometimes present, often involve less frequent, more flexible tasks, like changing the car oil every 6 months, which can be done almost any time, versus getting dinner on the table around 6 p.m. every single night.
And the very language men often use around housework, pitching in, helping out, reinforces the idea that it's fundamentally the wife's job and he's just assisting.
Exactly. The source quotes the writer Anna Quindlen, making that point brilliantly. When men do the dishes, it's called helping. When women do dishes, that's called life. There's even a finding cited from the Center for Work-Life Policy where 40% of professional wives felt their husbands actually created more work for them than they performed.
Oof. Okay, but the source does acknowledge that men's share of housework has increased somewhat from a very low baseline in the past.
Yes, it's important to note that. Men are doing more than previous generations, especially husbands of working wives. The percentage of women saying their husbands did absolutely no time on housework has plummeted over the past century. Studies show men's reported hours did increase from the mid-60s to the mid-70s or 80s. In surveys of dual-career couples, the median reported hours were around 5 per week for men, compared to 20 for women. Men's self-reported share might have doubled from maybe 10% in 1970 to 20% in 1990.
Okay, so double is an increase, but it still leaves women doing, what, 80% of the work, 4 times as much, even in those dual-earner homes?
Exactly. And the source adds further nuance. It notes that studies relying on time diaries, which track actual activities rather than self-reports, often show an even larger gap. One national survey found husbands doing about 14 hours a week while wives did 31. When both parents work full-time, it was closer to 16 hours for husbands and 28 for wives.
Still a significant disparity.
Yes. And the source points out that U.S. men's participation still lags significantly behind men in some European countries, like Sweden. And perhaps most crucially, that increase in men's domestic labor seemed to have largely leveled off since the mid-1980s. The progress stalled.
And does participation vary by background, like class or race?
Yes, the source indicates it does. Younger men tend to do more than older generations, but still far less than their wives. There are also racial and class differences noted. Some studies show Black and Hispanic men tend to do more housework than white men, especially when children are present. And white men's share only approaches equality when their wives are unemployed. Interestingly, blue-collar fathers are reported to be twice as likely as professional or managerial fathers to be the primary caregiver for children while their wives work, often due to the necessity of arranging split shifts or using informal flex time to manage childcare costs.
And the source makes another crucial point we touched on earlier. The presence of children actually increases the gender gap in domestic labor.
This is a key finding emphasized in the source. Mothers spend significantly more time with children than fathers do, especially when children are infants. Paternal engagement is often reported as very low then. Mothers spend about 50% more time with school-aged children. Men's share tends to increase as children get older, perhaps shifting towards more fun activities.
And the time spent alone with children.
The difference there is stark, according to the data presented. Fathers average about 5.5 hours per week alone with their children, while mothers average 19.5 hours per week, a 350% difference. The source concludes that when couples have children, men tend to work more paid hours, to earn more or because they want or able to, while wives often work less paid hours. This dynamic exaggerates the gender gaps both at work and at home.
And children internalize these gendered expectations about chores through their own assigned responsibilities in the home, don't they?
Absolutely. The source cites a 1991 study showing that daughters of women working full-time were doing over 10 hours of housework per week, while their brothers were doing less than 3 hours per week. A table included in the source clearly shows girls spending more total time on chores and doing more of the traditional female tasks like cleaning, laundry, cooking, and caring for others, while boys do more of the typical male tasks like taking out trash or yard work, but for fewer total hours overall.
So the gendered division of labor is literally being passed down to the next generation through childhood chores.
That's the clear implication. The source also mentions that one of the best predictors of whether a man will participate significantly in childcare is whether his own father did housework in childcare. It suggests these patterns are deeply learned.
Okay, so despite the slow pace of change overall in housework, the source does suggest there's some evidence of change specifically in men's involvement as fathers, more so than as husbands, perhaps.
Yes, that seems to be where the most movement is happening. The major pull for men towards domestic involvement appears to be motivated by their role as fathers rather than their role as husbands. Men might still hold contradictory ideas, wanting to shield their wives from unpleasantness, perhaps, but refusing what they see as degrading tasks like cleaning toilets. The source quotes Martha Farnsworth Rich, suggesting men, by and large, just don't care as much if the house is clean. And it includes that quote from The Weary Wife again, I do my half, I do half of my husband's half, and the rest doesn't get done.
But as fathers, men express a greater willingness or at least desire to be more involved.
Yes. Polls cited in the source show significant percentages of fathers saying that being a parent is more important to them than it was for their own fathers, and claiming they spend more time with their children than their fathers did. Another survey found about a fifth of managerial men would actually prefer to be home caring for family if they were financially comfortable enough to do so, though the income level required for that comfort was notably high.
And even cultural advisors like Dr. Benjamin Spock evolved their advice over the decades to reflect this shift.
Right. The source contrasts Spock's original 1946 edition of Baby and Child Care, which suggested fathers help out occasionally, maybe making the formula on Sunday, with the 1998 edition. The later version reflected men's increasing participation and explicitly stated that fathers should be able to do these jobs just as well as mothers, and crucially, not as a favor to the wife, because that implies it isn't really his work, too. The source uses a cartoon, figure 6.5, of a man asking his boss for 18 years of back pay because his wife just had a baby to humorously make the point about the absurdity of not seeing domestic work and childcare as real, valuable labor deserving support.
Yet, even with this shift in attitude compared to other industrialized nations, U.S. men's actual participation in childcare still lags behind.
Yes. The source notes it's double in countries like the Netherlands and significantly higher in places like Australia, Canada, and Britain. The source recounts that anecdote about Congresswoman Pat Schroeder's husband publicly promising, after her election, to take the kids to the pediatrician, only for him to sheepishly admit later he'd do it if she asked him to. It perfectly highlights that persistent gap between good intentions or rhetoric and actually taking initiative and responsibility.
And many men themselves lament not having enough time with their families, often blaming work demands.
The source quotes Senator Paul Tsongas's famous line, "No man on his deathbed ever regretted spending too much time with his family." But there's also the real fear men face of being perceived as less committed to their careers if they prioritize family, the so-called daddy track. Some men express feeling their nurturing impulse dry up because of the intense focus required by their careers.
But there is a growing trend, the source suggests, of some men actually starting to make career sacrifices for family time.
Yes. The source cites a study from DuPont Corporation showing significant percentages of managerial men, as well as women, turning down promotions, relocation opportunities, or assignments involving extensive travel specifically to spend more time with their families. The source calls this a relatively new development and a sign of some men beginning to walk one's talk when it comes to family commitment.
And what are the benefits when men are more involved at home, according to the source?
The source lists several significant payoffs. Men who do more housework tend to be better, more engaged fathers. Men who report closer relationships with their children also report greater marital satisfaction and better personal health. They feel less stress and less pressure to constantly be successful, powerful, and competitive. They even tend to live longer. The source includes that quip from The Economist, "Change a nappy and put years on your life."
So it's good for the men themselves.
Yes. And sociologist Barbara Risman, cited in the source, notes that when men take full responsibility for caregiving, they develop intimate, affectionate relationships, and the act of nurturing itself is good for men's health. Plus, of course, it benefits women by freeing them from some of the burden of the second shift.
And it benefits gender equality more broadly.
Crucially, the source reiterates that anthropology research consistently finds that women's status is highest in cultures where men take a larger, more active role in domestic work and childcare. The source predicts that a society where men and women truly share parenting will also inevitably be a society where they are equally active and valued in the paid labor force. Change in the private sphere drives dramatic changes in the public sphere.
Okay, so we've talked about the gender dynamics within the family. Now, the source identifies many issues often framed as problems with the family, like daycare, teen pregnancy, fatherlessness, but it argues many of these are actually constructed problems. What does that mean?
Basically, the source argues these aren't inherent flaws in families themselves, but rather problems that stem from the immense strain placed on families trying to navigate modern work and life, often without sufficient societal or structural support. They are deeply rooted in gender inequality and sometimes arise from the backlash against attempts to remedy that inequality. The source argues these kinds of problems will likely only ease with the concerted national effort to reduce gender inequality both at home and in the workplace, providing real support for families.
Let's look at the first example, the problem of daycare, viewed through this lens.
The source first outlines the reality of daycare in the U.S. Many parents are reluctant to use it. There's no national funding system. Employer contributions are minimal, like 1% of the total spent. Finding quality care, especially for infants and toddlers, is difficult, and the cost can be absolutely staggering for families.
Okay, that's the practical reality. But what does the research actually say about the effects of daycare on children?
This is where it gets interesting. The source presents the most common conclusion from decades of research. There are generally no negative psychological, intellectual, developmental, or emotional consequences for children resulting from being in daycare.
No negative consequences. In fact, some studies even show positive effects.
Yes, things like increased curiosity, better social skills like sharing, more friendships, and being better prepared for school. A large, comprehensive NIH study cited found that children's attachment to their mothers is not affected by being in daycare, regardless of the age they started or how many hours they spent there.
So the real problem, according to the source's analysis, isn't daycare itself. The problem is the lack of sufficient, affordable, high-quality daycare, and the fact that government and employers don't prioritize children's well-being by funding it adequately.
Precisely. But the constructed problem, the way the issue is often framed in public debate, the source argues, is the constant bombardment of headlines focusing on negative possibilities, like rare cases of child sexual abuse in care settings. This framing is used implicitly or explicitly to suggest children should be home with their mothers, where they belong. The debate about daycare in this framing isn't really about childcare options. It's actually a proxy debate about whether women should be working outside the home at all.
That underlying agenda, the source quotes someone making a pretty charged comparison to illustrate this point, right?
Yes, it quotes William R. Maddox of the Conservative Family Research Council, comparing a nanny reading a story to a mother doing so, and then comparing valuing a mother's presence to a paid substitute as being like saying the value of a wife making love to her husband is equal to the rate charged by prostitutes.
Wow, that comparison really underscores the intense emotional and ideological resistance behind the seemingly practical debate about daycare.
It does. And the source directly refutes the underlying assumption driving that resistance. There is no evidence that mothers working adversely affects children's development. In fact, most evidence presented shows direct and indirect benefits for children having expanded role models, developed more egalitarian gender role attitudes, viewing women's employment positively. Daughters of employed women are more likely to be employed in similar kinds of jobs themselves, and adolescent children of working mothers often take on more responsibility at home, which can increase their self-esteem.
Okay, so daycare is one constructed problem. Another the source tackles is babies having babies, the issue of teen pregnancy.
This is often linked to anxieties about changing sexuality and family structures. While the source notes teen pregnancy rates have actually declined since 1990, the U.S. still has remarkably high rates compared to other industrialized nations, double the UK's rate, for instance, according to a table referenced.
And the source points out the slightly contradictory nature of the debate. Some people who worry intensely about teen pregnancy also complain about women delaying childbearing into their 30s or 40s.
Yes, suggesting a kind of Goldilocks standard where women are criticized no matter when they have children too young or too old is always wrong. The source argues that the intense focus on teen motherhood often masks a deeper societal discomfort with women's sexual agency and serves as a disguised critique of feminism for supposedly enabling freer sexuality.
And often, efforts to reduce teen pregnancy involve restricting access to birth control and abortion services.
That's a key connection the source makes. But it then presents strong research evidence showing that restricting access to birth control, comprehensive sex education, or abortion has no demonstrable effect on the rates of teenage sexual activity.
Really? No effect.
None on activity rates, according to the studies cited. In fact, comprehensive sex education studies tend to show decreases in overall sexual activity, greater selectivity in partners, and safer sex practices when activity does occur. The source argues that young people are likely to become sexually active in their mid-teens, regardless of access restrictions. Therefore, restricting access primarily serves to encourage unwanted pregnancy. It notes that the highest teen pregnancy rates occurred before abortion was legalized.
And framing the issue as babies having babies conveniently places all the blame on young women while overlooking male responsibility in pregnancy.
Exactly. The source uses the phrase, if they are going to dance, engage in sexual activity, they will have to pay the piper, suffer the consequences of unwanted pregnancy. It argues that since it takes two to tango, any effective solution must also involve fostering more responsible young manhood.
And the source highlights another, even more serious problem that gets masked by the babies having babies framing.
Yes, this is a critical point. The frequently sexual victimization of young, often underage girls by adult men. The source points out that statistical analysis reveals most fathers of babies born to teen mothers are actually adult men, often significantly older. Their predatory behavior often goes completely unnoticed or unaddressed when the public focus is solely on the immorality or irresponsibility of the teenage mother.
That is a crucial and disturbing point the source raises, completely shifting the focus from the young woman to the often overlooked adult male involved. Okay, the last constructed problem the source discusses is fatherlessness.
This issue directly raises the question of men's responsibility within the family or lack thereof. Commentators frequently lament the absence of fathers, whether due to divorce or general disengagement, and blame this absence for a whole host of social problems: juvenile delinquency, crime, violence, unemployment. The source mentions common claims, like that 70% of juveniles in state reform institutions come from fatherless homes.
And there's that specific argument that boys in particular need a male presence, a father figure, to learn how to be men, that mothers simply cannot raise boys properly on their own.
Yes. The source quotes several proponents of this idea, like Frank Pittman stating unequivocally that a mother is able to show a male child how to be a man is false, or David Blankenhorn claiming flatly, fatherless boys commit crimes. It also quotes Robert Bly suggesting that without a father's guidance, the demons have full permission to rage in boys. There's this underlying fear articulated of unattached and unconstrained males roaming the streets, with sociologist David Papineau calling the unattached male universally the cause of numerous social ills.
But the source challenges this dominant narrative with data and alternative interpretations, doesn't it?
It does. It first acknowledges the statistical reality, the increase in children being raised by unmarried mothers, but then it immediately counterbalances this by highlighting the dramatic increase in the number of single fathers raising children from a relatively small number in 1970 to over 2 million more recently, adding, pointedly, without much appreciable decrease in raging demons across the general population.
That juxtaposition really weakens the simplistic father abscess automatically equals social pathology equation, doesn't it?
It certainly complicates it. The source acknowledges the real problem of what it calls the masculinization of irresponsibility, where some fathers fail to provide economically for their children. But it fundamentally questions the causal link often drawn between father absence and social problems like crime. Is father absence the cause, or is it merely correlated with other factors? Could the causation even run the other way? Perhaps criminality leads to father absence.
So what does the source propose as the more likely underlying cause?
The source's central argument here is that high crime rates, ADT, high rates of fatherlessness, are often both consequences of a larger, overwhelming problem: poverty.
And the National Academy of Sciences research cited supports this view.
Yes. Their analysis found that the single best predictor of violent crime rates is not fatherlessness, but personal and neighborhood income. Since fatherlessness itself is statistically much more common in lower-income families and neighborhoods, the source argues that the so-called crisis of fatherlessness is perhaps more accurately understood as a crisis of poverty.
The source also mentions other research challenging the direct father absence link to things like gang involvement.
Right. It cites Martin Sanchez-Jankowski's research on gangs, which found just as many members coming from intact nuclear families as from father-absent ones, and just as many maintaining close family ties as those who denied them. This suggests something other than just the presence or absence of a father figure is at work in driving these outcomes.
So the source suggests a confusion of correlation with causation and maybe even confusing consequence with cause.
Exactly. Fatherlessness might be a consequence of structural forces like chronic unemployment, low wages, demanding work schedules that drive fathers away from the home or make stable family formation difficult, rather than being the primary cause of social problems itself.
And the source notes that pundits often use the fatherlessness narrative to indirectly blame feminism and women working outside the home, expressing a yearning for a return to the traditional nuclear family model with its inherent gender inequality.
Precisely. The source cites David Papineau again, quoting his nostalgic description of the idealized 1950s family with its sharp division of labor, the male as primary provider and ultimate authority, and critiques this perspective for substituting form for content. It assumes that the specific structure, the form of the family, automatically dictates its success or failure, ignoring the actual quality of relationships within it. The source also points out that historically the concept of paternal responsibility was often tied more to legal lineage, providing protection and representing the family's interests in the larger world tasks that didn't necessarily require constant presence in the child's nursery.
Okay, so many of these highly debated problems with the family are, according to the source's analysis, symptoms of deeper structural issues, often economic, which are then exacerbated by rigid gender expectations and a lack of societal support for diverse ways of forming and maintaining families.
Which brings us to the issues the source identifies as real, undeniable problems facing contemporary families.
Okay, let's turn to those now. The source is very clear on the first one. Divorce is a real problem.
It doesn't shy away from that conclusion at all. The U.S. divorce rate is described as astonishingly high, hovering around half of all marriages end in divorce. This rate is considerably higher than in most other industrialized countries, often double or nearly double the rates seen in places like Germany, France, Sweden, or Britain, according to a table referenced.
And the source suggests a reason for that difference.
It notes that many of those other countries provide significantly more public support for families. Things like national health care, robust public education, child support stipends, which help cushion the harsh economic impact of divorce, making it less devastating for the individuals involved, especially women and children.
And how does divorce as an outcome interact with gender inequality?
The source argues that while liberalized divorce laws might have reduced certain inequalities within marriage by making exit possible, they tend to exacerbate gender inequality after the marriage dissolves. Divorce, it states, exaggerates gender differences and the resulting inequalities. There are distinctly his and her. Divorces, the experience and consequences are often very different for men and women.
How are those experiences typically different, according to the source?
Primarily, the difference is economic for women and more emotional or psychological for men. The source cites Leonore Weitzman's influential mid-1980s research, which calculated a dramatic drop 73% in a woman's standard of living post-divorce, while a man's increased by 42%. Now, the source acknowledges these specific numbers have been revised and are seen as perhaps overly dramatic, but it states that subsequent research still consistently finds that women's economic resources tend to decline significantly more than men's after divorce, particularly if the wife hadn't established a strong independent career during the marriage. Sociologist Paul Amato is cited, finding that the greater the overall gender inequality in a society, the more detrimental the economic impact of divorce is, specifically for women. Men, conversely, are often more likely to experience negative emotional or psychological impacts from the divorce itself.
And the source notes a striking point about the reasons women often cite for initiating divorce.
Yes, one study reference found that 3 out of 4 women seeking divorce listed pathological behaviors by their male partners, things like adultery, domestic violence, substance abuse, or abandonment as the primary reason for ending the marriage.
This difficult reality of divorce then leads directly to the issue of paternal withdrawal afterwards.
It's presented as a significant and troubling problem in the source. Many divorced fathers lose almost all contact with their children over time. Data cited suggests over half have no contact at all, and about a third of non-custodial fathers who technically have visitation provisions haven't actually seen their children in the past year.
That's a huge number of absent fathers. How does that compare to non-custodial mothers?
The contrast is stark, according to the source. Non-custodial mothers rarely lose contact. They tend to maintain those family connections, often prioritizing them over new employment or new relationships.
So women tend to maintain that parental connection much more consistently after divorce.
It appears so. The source explores what predicts continued parental involvement after divorce, noting that the quality of the relationship between the ex-spouses before the divorce plays a role. But it presents a somewhat counterintuitive finding regarding fathers' prior involvement.
What's that finding?
Research cited suggests that men who were more involved with their children before the divorce were actually most likely to disappear afterwards. Conversely, men who had been relatively uninvolved before the divorce sometimes tended to become more active afterwards.
That seems completely backwards. What's the explanation offered?
The source cites Edward Crick's reasoning. He suggests that the less involved fathers might have been more traditional in their views and thus felt a stronger sense of continued obligation to the idea of family life even after the marriage ended. The more involved, perhaps more liberal men, conversely, might have seen the end of the marriage as freeing them from those responsibilities altogether.
That's a complex psychological dynamic. Now, the public debate about divorce often fixates, sometimes almost exclusively, on its supposedly devastating impact on children.
Yes. The source discusses Judith Wallerstein's widely publicized and highly influential study from the 1970s and 80s. Her research concluded that a significant number of children suffer long-term, even permanent detrimental effects from their parents' divorce, losing the family scaffolding. Problems, she argued, often emerge years later, especially difficulties in forming their own stable relationships. Her ultimate widely quoted conclusion was stark. A lousy marriage beats a good divorce, and even a good enough marriage enhances children's lives compared to divorce.
Her work has had a massive impact on public perception, hasn't it?
Immense. Countless magazine covers, as the source notes. But the source then offers a significant critique of Wallerstein's research methodology and conclusions, arguing it had far less social science behind it than often assumed.
What were the main criticisms?
Several key issues. Her study lacked a control group, making it impossible to know if divorce was truly the cause of the problems observed. or if those problems might have existed anyway. About a third of the original children weren't interviewed in later follow-ups. Perhaps they were the ones who adjusted successfully. And crucially, the participants were recruited through an offer of free therapy specifically for families having a difficult time coping with the divorce. This means, the source argues, that most participants likely had serious psychological problems to begin with, before the divorce even happened. Wallerstein herself acknowledged this in earlier publications.
So the study sample wasn't representative, and divorce might have been an outcome of pre-existing problems, not the primary cause of later difficulties.
That's the source's strong critique. It argues that the public narrative about the inevitable harm of divorce has often been shaped by this potentially flawed or at least non-generalizable study.
So what does other, perhaps more methodologically sound research find about children and divorce?
The source presents findings from other researchers that paint a different picture. Andrew Sherlin's work, for example, found that children whose parents would later divorce already showed more emotional problems at age 7 than children from families that remained stable. His conclusion: divorce often occurs in families that are already troubled. It's an outcome, not the starting point of the trouble.
And does most research suggest children are generally more resilient than Wallerstein's study indicated?
Yes. The source states that the majority of research finds that after an initial period of upset and adjustment, most children settle down and return to a normal process of maturation. About 3/4 of children of divorce are found to be coping reasonably well in the longer term. Most recover successfully, especially if they have adequate psychological support from parents and sufficient economic resources.
Now, this isn't to say divorce isn't difficult for children, or that having two supportive parents isn't generally better than one, right?
Absolutely not. The source acknowledges divorce is tough for kids, and having two parents who are less tired, less overworked, and can provide more interaction is generally beneficial. Two people raising children together, regardless of their sexual orientation, is likely better for children than one person trying to do it all alone.
But the source challenges the common comparison of divorced families versus intact families, as if all else is equal.
Right. Because all else is usually not equal. Divorce, the source stresses, is typically a remedy chosen for a bad marriage, not a decision made lightly from a perfectly happy, stable situation.
So the crucial comparison isn't divorced versus happily intact, but rather divorce versus staying in an intact but unhappy, high-conflict marriage.
Precisely. And on that comparison, the source states the evidence is quite clear. The outcome for children depends heavily on the level of marital conflict before the divorce occurred.
What did the studies find?
One study cited found that while children in divorced families reported feeling lonely or rejected more often than those in happily intact families, children in unhappily married, high-conflict families reported the highest levels of feeling neglected and humiliated. Longitudinal studies following children over many years found that problems like aggression or impulsivity often long antedated the divorce itself. Problems in young children could even predict which families would later divorce. The children's problems did not necessarily result from the divorce itself.
And the source highlights research by Paul Amato and Alan Booth as particularly key here.
Yes. Their extensive research found that the single best predictor of a child's happiness and overall well-being is the quality of their parents' marriage. And here's the crucial finding, illustrated in a figure in the source, figure 6.6. In high-conflict families, children actually had higher levels of well-being if their parents divorced than if they stayed together. Conversely, in low-conflict families, children had higher well-being if their parents stayed together.
That's a really important distinction. The impact of divorce depends entirely on the level of conflict it resolves.
Exactly. The source concludes, divorce is beneficial for children when it removes them from a high-conflict marriage. It is deleterious when it removes them from a low-conflict marriage where parents were generally getting along.
So the consensus from the research presented seems to be that the level of conflict is more important than the structure.
Yes, the preponderance of research echoes this. The level of family conflict is more critical than simply staying together for the sake of the children. Frequent, intense conflict in an intact family is demonstrably harmful to children's development. Divorce, in those high-conflict situations, may actually insulate children from interactions that threaten their health and well-being. The quality of parent-child relationships before the marital conflict escalated is also key to how psychologically catastrophic the divorce process is. Again and again, the source emphasizes content matters more than form.
The source uses that powerful analogy. Blaming children's problems solely on divorce is a bit like stating that cancer is caused by chemotherapy.
Right. Both divorce and chemotherapy are difficult, often painful processes, but they may be the necessary and ultimately healthiest option given the underlying condition, whether it's cancer or a high-conflict damaging marriage. The source also notes that public opinion seems to grasp this nuance. A 1990 Gallup poll found 70% of Americans agreed that unhappily married parents with young children should separate rather than raise them in a hostile atmosphere. Only 24% said they should stay together no matter what for the sake of the children.
Yeah.
Americans seem to agree content matters.
So the source concludes that divorce, while a serious issue and not to be undertaken lightly, is a necessary safety valve for high-conflict households. Ending an unhappy marriage is often preferable to living in constant tension and acrimony. Most families adjust, and some even thrive post-divorce.
And importantly, the source suggests divorce should also be seen as a social indicator. The fact that nearly half of marriages fail suggests something is fundamentally wrong or unsupported within the institution of marriage itself. The foundation can't seem to support half the structures built on it without significant effort from policymakers to strengthen it. The source quotes family therapist Betty Carter powerfully. If any other institution failed half its participants so consistently, we would demand that the institution change, not just blame the people within it.
That perspective really shifts the focus. Okay, related to divorce is the next real problem the source identifies: child custody disputes and arrangements.
Yes. Unlike death, which simply dissolved a marriage historically, divorce requires making complex decisions about where children will live and how they will be cared for. The criteria used for making custody decisions have shifted dramatically over time. Before the Industrial Revolution, children were often seen as economic assets, potential laborers. Custody in disputes usually went to fathers, based largely on an economic means test who could provide financially. Then, as childhood came to be seen differently in the early 20th century, with children viewed more as needing care and nurture, a luxury, custody norms shifted toward mothers, based on the tender years doctrine, assuming young children needed maternal care.
And today,
The legal standard is generally the best interests of the child. But in practice, the source notes, there's often still a presumption that the child's best interests are met by being with the mother, especially for young children. This reflects the reality that mothers still perform the vast majority of the day-to-day caretaking tasks in most families.
which, given the gendered division of labor we discussed, makes a certain practical sense.
It does. Although the source also notes that fathers started gaining custody much more frequently beginning in the late 1970s. One study found 63% of fathers who requested custody received it then, a significant increase.
The source mentions a large California study by McCoby and Mnookin that looked closely at custody arrangements.
Yes, they studied about 1,000 divorces. They found that the majority of both mothers and fathers actually wanted joint legal custody. However, their data also showed that gender still matters significantly in how parents acted on those desires. Mothers were far more likely to actually file requests for the custody arrangement they wanted. Fathers were more likely to request less than they said they ideally wanted, perhaps anticipating bias or conflict. The source suggests this implies men may need to be more assertive upfront in asking for equal involvement to avoid bitterness later.
But the most crucial finding from that McCoby and Mnookin study wasn't just about who got legal custody, was it?
No. Similar to the findings on divorce outcomes, their key finding was that child welfare post-divorce depended less on the specific custody label, mother, father, joint, and much more on how the household was managed and how well the parents cooperated after the separation. Children living primarily with mothers generally did just as well psychologically as those living primarily with fathers, provided the home environment was stable and conflict was low.
A major consequence, though, of current custody arrangements, often favoring mothers for physical custody, is that issue of paternal withdrawal we touched on earlier.
It's a significant consequence highlighted again here. Fathers might withdraw due to feeling bereft at losing daily contact, feeling euphoric about perceived freedom, or simply wanting to escape ongoing conflict with the ex-spouse. The source cites Furstenberg and Sherlin's idea again, that many men seem to view parenting and marriage as a linked package deal. When the marriage ends, they stop actively being fathers.
And the statistics are quite stark.
Around half of children living primarily with their mothers hadn't seen their fathers in the past year, according to one national sample cited. And child support payment is another related issue. About half of divorced fathers in the U.S. pay no child support, compared to maybe a quarter in Europe where enforcement might be stronger or support systems different.
And the source highlights that surprising finding again. that paternal withdrawal after divorce affects the father-daughter relationship even more significantly than the father-son relationship.
Yes, which runs counter to many cultural narratives focused only on the importance of the father-son bond. The mother-daughter relationship appears most resilient post-divorce. The source uses this finding to argue that daughters' needs are often ignored in these discussions and that both boys and girls clearly benefit from continued paternal responsibility and presence.
So given all this, what would a custody system truly focused on the best interests of the child look like, according to the source's analysis?
The source suggests that if all things are truly equal, meaning there's no danger of abuse, the parents can manage their conflict effectively without using children as pawns, and both parents agree to provide equal financial and emotional support, then joint physical and legal custody ought to be the starting point, the norm.
And the research suggests joint custody can work well for kids.
Yes. The source notes it can be harder logistically for parents, but children in joint custody arrangements often report feeling loved by both parents and maintaining attachment to two psychological parents. Contrary to some popular opinions, it doesn't necessarily create confusion or instability for children. Research suggests it seems to benefit them, with children reporting higher satisfaction and seeing having two homes as advantageous.
But the source offers a critique of how the current custody system might be evolving, moving away from prioritizing actual care provided.
It raises a concern. What started as a system prioritizing actual care, which often favored women due to the existing division of labor, might be evolving in some ways to devalue the content and necessity of that day-to-day care. This could give men, who may have provided less of that care during the marriage, more than an equal chance at custody, based simply on biological equality or other non-nurturing factors that might favor men in court proceedings.
So a truly judicious system would need to recognize the reality of potentially different inputs during the marriage.
Yes. The source suggests an ideal system would somehow recognize the real differences in inputs, the actual time, involvement, and care provided between mothers and fathers during the marriage, while still presuming that both parents are capable and interested in maintaining continued committed relationships with the child after divorce, unless there's clear evidence to the contrary, like abuse.
And the source connects fathers' rights back to their responsibilities during the marriage.
Right. It concludes that fathers' rights post-divorce will likely come more readily and be seen as more legitimate if fathers more consistently recognize and fulfill their responsibilities for care during the marriage.
Okay, this brings us to another issue. The source identifies as primarily a constructed problem, the existence and recognition of gay and lesbian families.
Yes, the source points out the deep irony here. The very people who fret most loudly about the decline of the family are often the most vehemently opposed to the creation and legal recognition of families headed by gay men and lesbians. It argues the debate is often less about the well-being of these families themselves and more about the broader legal status and societal acceptance of homosexual individuals.
And the source provides concrete examples of the political and legal resistance these families face.
Absolutely. It mentions state legislatures scrambling to pass laws denying legal recognition, full faith and credit, to potential same-sex marriages after a Hawaii Supreme Court decision raised the possibility in the late 90s. It also points to the Federal Defense of Marriage Act, DOMA, passed, as the source puts it, as if the institution of marriage were under attack by those who seek to enter it.
And legal rights regarding children, like adoption, were also severely limited at the time the source was written.
Yes, a figure in the source, figure 6.7, shows a map indicating that explicit legal adoption by gay or lesbian couples was allowed in only about 10 states plus D.C. at that time.
The source suggests this intense controversy stems from discomfort and misinformation, often linked back to fundamental issues of gender difference and inequality.
Exactly. It argues that concern for the sanctity of marriage often serves as a cover for discomfort with gay and lesbian relationships, a discomfort frequently fueled by misinformation.
What kind of misinformation does the source address?
Common stereotypes, like the idea that gay male relationships are inherently more fragile, or that gay men are inherently more promiscuous. The source acknowledges these stereotypes might hold some truth for gay men compared to lesbians, but argues this isn't inherent.
So the source offers explanations for why gay male relationships might face more challenges than lesbian or heterosexual ones.
Yes, it links potential instability to several factors. Traditional masculine gender socialization, which often discourages domestic commitment and emotional intimacy, the historical exclusion from the legal institution of marriage, which provides social recognition and stability, the frequent lack of children, often a factor motivating heterosexual couples to work through relationship problems, and the constant external stress caused by social disapproval and homophobia, which can destabilize any relationship.
The source quotes a marriage rights advocate making a key point about this.
Yes, Craig Dean of the Marriage Rights Fund highlights the paradox. Mainstream society often claims gays and lesbians are incapable of maintaining long-term relationships while simultaneously denying them access to the very institution marriage that is designed to support and stabilize long-term relationships for heterosexual couples.
And denying the right to marry sends a powerful message that gay relationships are less valuable.
That's the source's argument. Marriage is more than just a personal relationship, it's a social institution. Denying access codifies gay relationships as less valuable, less legitimate. This societal devaluation, the source suggests, can contribute to the very behaviors, like potentially higher rates of casual sex among some gay men, that are then used as a rationale for continuing to deny marriage rights. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy fueled by discrimination. A table in the source, Table 6.5, likely illustrates related points about marriage benefits.
The source also uses data from Gary Gates at the UCLA Williams Institute, presented as a quiz to challenge common, often inaccurate media images of gay and lesbian families typically portrayed as affluent, white, urban couples.
Yes, the quiz findings presented are quite surprising and counter-stereotypical. For example, a significant percentage, about 27% of same-sex couples are raising children. And contrary to stereotypes, they are most likely to be doing so in states like Mississippi, not just perceived liberal hubs like California or Massachusetts.
And these families are more diverse than often assumed.
Significantly more diverse. Nearly half, 45% of children being raised by same-sex couples are non-white, making these families more racially and ethnically diverse than those headed by heterosexual married parents. The parents themselves are also more diverse.
And economically, they often face more challenges, not fewer.
Right. Their median household income, $51,900 in the data cited, is actually lower than that of different sex married couples with children, $60,700. They tend to have fewer economic resources overall, are less educated on average, less likely to own homes, and the homes they do own are often less valuable.
The source also clarifies that most children in these families are not adopted.
Yes. While adoption rates are higher among same-sex couples and heterosexual couples, the vast majority of children identified in the census data were described as natural-born to one of the partners. And perhaps the most important finding presented from the body of research is this.
What's that?
Children raised by gay and lesbian parents fare, as well as children raised in other types of families, on a wide variety of standard child well-being measures. The source cites researchers Stacy and Viblars, indicating this is a consistent finding across studies.
That directly contradicts many common fears and arguments against gay parenting.
It does. The source also highlights the significant legal vulnerability these families face. About two-thirds of children being raised by same-sex couples live in states where their parents cannot automatically get joint parental rights through mechanisms like second-parent adoption. This lack of legal status has real consequences regarding things like medical decisions, inheritance, or school enrollment. This is a direct cost of marriage inequality.
So the conclusion from the research presented is clear. Gay and lesbian parents can be, and often are, excellent parents. The issues stem more from societal prejudice and lack of legal recognition.
That's the strong message from the source material. It draws a parallel. Just as heterosexual women were historically forced to choose between career and family, many gay men and lesbians felt forced to choose between expressing their sexuality and having a family. Today, much like women wanting to have it all, gays and lesbians increasingly believe their sexual orientation shouldn't disqualify them from being good parents and having fulfilling family lives.
And the number of children being raised in these families is not insignificant.
No, the numbers have increased dramatically since the 1970s. Estimates cited suggest somewhere between 8 and 13 million children in the U.S., around 5% of all U.S. children, are being raised by at least one gay parent.
The source actively debunks common fears about gay parenting, right?
Yes. It states there is no evidence that gay fathers or lesbian mothers negatively influence their children's development in any unique way, nor are they more likely to sexually abuse children, a common homophobic trope. In fact, some studies cited suggest outcomes for children in these families tend to be better than average on some measures.
Better? How so?
For fathers, coming out can sometimes relieve internal stress, potentially strengthening the father-child bond. Research specifically on lesbian mothers finds their children, both boys and girls, show similar patterns of gender identity development compared to children of heterosexual parents, and there are no significant differences in intelligence or overall adjustment. The crucial determinant, the research indicates, is the quality of mothering, not the mother's sexual orientation.
The source includes some compelling quotes illustrating the potential strengths of these families.
Yes, a quote from a 15-year-old daughter of a lesbian mother talks about feeling more open-minded and understanding that judging others based on difference is wrong. And a New Jersey court decision is quoted, suggesting children raised in gay or lesbian families might emerge better equipped to think critically, to see that the majority isn't always right, and to rely on reason and knowledge over popular sentiment or prejudice. Sociologist Judith Stacy, cited in the source, calls this potentially a child-rearing ideal for a democracy.
Are there any notable differences found in the children regarding gender roles or identity?
Some studies suggest potential differences. Daughters of lesbian or gay parents are sometimes found to be more assertive, confident, and ambitious. Sons may be less conforming to traditional norms of masculinity, like aggression and domination, perhaps exhibiting more fluid gender identities. Children raised by gay lesbian parents are also found to be more accepting of homosexuality and perhaps more willing to consider same-sex relationships themselves, though they are no more likely than other children to identify as gay or lesbian.
And the source emphasizes that secrecy and shame surrounding a parent's homosexuality are likely far more detrimental to a child's well-being than the homosexuality itself.
Absolutely. Mental health professionals cited argue that hiding a core part of one's identity sends a damaging message of shame to both the parent and the child. Studies found that when a mother's lesbianism was kept secret, children were perceived, by themselves and their mothers, as more moody, depressed, or withdrawn. The problem isn't the parent's identity, but the societal prejudice that forces it into secrecy.
So once again, the issue circles back to societal acceptance and support, rather than the family structure itself.
That's the consistent theme emerging from the source's analysis of these diverse family forms.
Okay, the source identifies one final issue as a real problem occurring within families, regardless of structure: family violence.
Yes, it confronts this harsh reality directly. For many individuals, the family is not a haven, but can be a cold and violent world. Violence, the source states, tears the very fabric of family life. While marital violence, typically husband against wife, is a major issue discussed elsewhere in Kimmel's book, this chapter focuses specifically on violence between parents and children, and violence among siblings.
And, like other aspects of family life we've discussed, family violence is presented as deeply gendered.
Yes. The source points out that the overwhelming amount of family violence is perpetrated by males. This includes husbands hitting wives, fathers hitting children, more often and more severely than mothers typically, sons hitting parents, and boys hitting siblings.
And this violence reinforces inequality.
The source quotes sociologist Murray Strauss arguing that the actual or implicit threat of physical coercion is one of many factors underlying male dominance in the family. Violence, or the threat of it, maintains power imbalances.
What about violence against children by parents, like corporal punishment or spanking?
This is presented as controversial but widespread. Most Americans approve of spanking, even though support drops sharply for systematic or extreme violence. Most Americans report having been hit as children, and most report hitting their own children.
But the source argues the costs outweigh the benefits?
Yes. While spanking might achieve immediate compliance, the source cites research associating it with negative long-term behaviors in children, such as increased aggression, antisocial behavior, and later mental health problems. The American Academy of Pediatrics officially opposes spanking. The source also includes a stark finding from one sample study. Every single perpetrator responsible for a child's death was found to be either the father or a father's surrogate, like a stepfather or mother's boyfriend.
That's incredibly disturbing. And the source suggests parental violence teaches children that violence is acceptable.
That's presented as the most evident consequence. Children who experience or witness violence learn that it's a legitimate way to resolve disputes and exert power, and they often learn to use it themselves. Violence between siblings is described as ubiquitous, and the long-term consequences can extend into adulthood. Experiencing greater corporal punishment as a child correlates with a greater probability of hitting one's own spouse as an adult.
The source also mentions child-to-parent violence.
Yes, acknowledging it as a serious, though less discussed, problem. About 1 in 10 parents of teenagers report being victims of violence by their children. Mothers are more likely to be victims than fathers, especially in cases of severe violence.
So violence is a deeply embedded gendered issue that can permeate family life, causing significant harm and reproducing inequality, regardless of the specific family form.
Which brings us full circle back to the source's most consistent finding, the core message that emerges from its analysis of divorce, custody, sexual orientation, and these internal dynamics.
That the form of the family matters far, far less for the well-being of children and adults than its content.
That's the absolute key takeaway reiterated throughout this section. The source argues our societal preoccupation with the size and shape of the package. Whether it's an intact nuclear family, a divorced family, a single-parent family, a step family, or one headed by lesbian or gay parents, distracts us from focusing on what actually nurtures children and supports healthy relationships.
And what is that crucial content, the essential ingredient?
The source states the strongest predictor of future physical, emotional, and psychological health for both children and parents is a home environment filled with love and support, where parents are able to spend both quality and quantity time with their children and with each other.
The source cites family sociologist Arlene Skolnick's work reinforcing this point.
Yes. Skolnick finds that the most reliable studies conclude family structure is not in itself the critical factor. What children fundamentally need is a warm, concerned relationship with at least one parent.
And the Harvard longitudinal study provides striking evidence for this.
It really does. That study tracked Harvard students from the 1950s for 35 years. It found a significant link between how much parental love and care the participants perceived receiving in childhood and their actual physical health outcomes in midlife. Those who perceived low levels of care had a much higher risk of serious illnesses like heart disease or cancer decades later. 87% and 25% in the high care group, even after controlling for other factors like smoking or family history. The content of that early relationship had a profound, measurable, long-lasting impact on physical health.
So the real crisis of the family, if there is one, is less about changing forms and more about the challenges to maintaining that positive, supportive content within families.
Exactly. The source acknowledges that measures of marital happiness and child well-being have shown some decline in recent decades. But it argues the negative consequences, often attributed solely to diverse family forms like divorce or single parenthood, have been greatly exaggerated, according to researcher David Damo cited. The family, at its heart, is a gendered institution, shaped by assumptions about difference and the reality of inequality, both interpersonal within the family and structural, imposed from outside.
Structural inequality, like the lack of adequate public support we've discussed?
Yes. Things like inadequate affordable childcare, the absence of paid parental leave for most workers, the failure to legally recognize and support different types of families, these policies, or lack thereof, maintain structural inequality, make family life harder, and can indirectly make children feel less valued by society. Interpersonal inequality, meanwhile, is expressed in that persistent gender division of labor at home, the different trajectories men and women often face after divorce, and the underlying, sometimes explicit threat of family violence.
But the source ends on a somewhat hopeful note, suggesting that achieving gender equality within families is possible and beneficial and doesn't require some radical dose of androgyny or men becoming like women.
Right. It doesn't argue for sameness. Men can return home and be more involved without being feminized, just as women enter the workforce without being masculinized. It predicts a potential reintegration of spheres in the 21st century, where the boundaries between home and work become more permeable and similar for both men and women, with both being more active in both realms.
It cites social critic Christopher Lasch advocating for this.
Yes, Lasch argued for insisting on a closer integration of professional and domestic lives, remodeling the workplace to accommodate family needs, rather than forcing families to subordinate themselves entirely to workplace demands. The source notes technology like telecommuting and home offices might be enabling this integration, allowing paid work to happen alongside domestic tasks like cooking or supervising children.
And the source predicts that as men and women move towards truly sharing housework and childcare more equitably, gender inequality, stereotypes, and extreme differences within the family will gradually decrease.
Yes. It circles back to that anthropological finding. Societies where men take a larger role in childcare consistently have the highest status for women. The source argues, therefore, that a society with truly shared parenting will inevitably also be a society with more equal participation in the labor force. Change in the private sphere of the family will bring about dramatic changes in the public sphere of work and politics.
This source leaves us with that poignant line from Robert Frost. Home is the place where, when you go there, they have to take you in.
It acknowledges that families do involve constraint, obligation, and duty. But at their best, they also offer profound love, respect, and honor. The source's final, powerful message is that this love, this essential positive content, can abide and flourish in all kinds of family forms: traditional nuclear families, single-parent families, step families, families headed by gay or lesbian parents. It's that capacity for love, nourishment, and mutual sustenance, the content that truly matters, wherever it lives and in whatever form.
Wow, what a comprehensive journey through the complexities, the myths, and the realities of the American family, all based on the analysis presented in this chapter of Kimmel's The Gendered Society. We've seen how the debates about a family crisis are often rooted in looking backward nostalgically or fundamentally misreading history.
How gender roles deeply shape individual experiences within the family, creating those his and her visions of marriage and divorce.
How perceived problems like daycare worries or fears about fatherlessness can often be viewed, according to the source, as symptoms masking deeper structural problems or anxieties about social change.
And we've explored the nuanced realities of issues like divorce, custody, and the experiences of diverse family structures, including those headed by gay and lesbian parents.
And throughout it all, we keep coming back to that core insight powerfully argued in the source. The love, the support, the shared time and responsibility within a family, its essential content, are the most critical factors for the well-being of both children and adults, far outweighing the specific form or structure the family takes.
Absolutely. By taking this deep dive with us into the source material, you've hopefully gained a much richer, more complex understanding of the forces shaping family life today, moving beyond those simplistic narratives we often hear.
And that leaves you, our listener, with a compelling thought to consider as we wrap up. If the quality of the relationships and the shared life within the family is truly paramount, as this source argues based on the evidence presented, what tangible steps could you take, perhaps within your own family, or advocate for in your community, your workplace, or through public policy, to prioritize nurturing that essential content?
How can we collectively shift our focus away from judging family forms and instead concentrate on actively supporting the fundamental functions of love, care, and shared responsibility for everyone, regardless of how their family happens to be structured?
How might that shift in focus from crisis rooted in form to strength rooted in content fundamentally change the conversation? And, more importantly, the lived reality for families across the country? Something to think about.